The sky over northern Germany was already alive with fire. It was late November, 1943, when a young American pilot named Charlie Brown flew toward the city of Bremen, staring straight into the most dangerous airspace he had ever known. Below him waited one of the most heavily defended targets in the Reich. Ahead of him, hundreds of black flak bursts bloomed across the sky like violent flowers, tearing apart the morning air. Charlie Brown was only 21 years old. He had never flown a combat mission before. This was his first. His aircraft was a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Ye Olde Pub. It carried 10 men and a full load of bombs, aimed at a German fighter factory producing Focke-Wulf aircraft. During the briefing that morning, intelligence officers warned the crews to expect fierce resistance. What they did not mention was that Brown's bomber had been assigned the most dangerous position in the formation. The airmen had a name for it. They called it the Purple Heart Corner. It was the slot where German fighters always attacked first. Defensive fire from nearby bombers could not overlap properly. New crews were often placed there, whether by rotation or cruel luck. And Brown's crew was the newest of all. Before Ye Olde Pub could even reach the bomb run, a burst of flak exploded directly in front of the cockpit. The nose of the aircraft shattered. Freezing air rushed inside at hurricane speed. One engine died instantly. Another began overheating. The bomber slowed, fell behind, and within moments, the formation moved on without them. They were alone. German fighters saw it immediately. More than a dozen Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters descended on the crippled bomber, attacking again and again. Cannon fire tore through the fuselage. A gunner was killed instantly. Others were wounded. Charlie Brown himself was hit, his right arm useless, blood freezing almost as soon as it spilled. At that altitude, the cold was lethal. Oxygen systems failed. Guns froze solid. Of the many machine guns on board, only a few still worked. One by one, crew members lost consciousness as oxygen ran out. Brown's vision narrowed. His hands slipped from the controls. The last thing he thought before everything went black was that his crew would die on their very first mission. The bomber fell. It plunged thousands of feet in an uncontrolled dive, shaking violently as airspeed climbed far beyond safety limits. Wings threatened to tear away. Any second could have been the last. Then, against all logic, Charlie Brown regained consciousness. Thicker air brought oxygen back into his lungs. With what little strength he had left, he pulled the bomber out of the dive, leveling off barely above the treetops. Blood covered the cockpit. Men were wounded or dead. The aircraft was barely flying. And then Brown realized something worse. They were flying directly over a German airfield. On that airfield, a Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Stigler was refueling his Messerschmitt. He had already shot down multiple American bombers that day. When he looked up, he saw the shattered B-17 limping across the sky, slow, wounded, and completely defenseless. If you want to understand how one decision in that moment would defy war, orders, and ideology itself, make sure you subscribe now. What happens next is one of the most extraordinary encounters of the Second World War. Stigler scrambled into his fighter and took off. Within minutes, he was flying behind Ye Olde Pub, finger resting on the trigger. One burst was all it would take. Another victory. Another burning bomber falling from the sky. But when Stigler looked closely, what he saw inside that aircraft would change everything he believed about honor, duty, and the enemy he had been trained to destroy. Franz Stigler was 28 years old. He had already flown 487 combat missions, and 17 enemy aircraft lay shattered beneath his wings. His brother, August, had been killed during a bombing raid over England in 1940, leaving a permanent mark on the young pilot. Before the war, Franz had been a commercial pilot for Lufthansa. ferrying passengers across Europe in peace. He had never imagined that those skills would one day be used to kill men he had never met, men who now occupied the sky before him. But Germany had called, and Stigler had answered. By December 1943, he was one of the most experienced pilots in Jagdgeschwader 27, a unit hardened by battle and fear. That morning he had already downed multiple American bombers, tallying victories with clinical precision. But then he saw it. Ye Old Pub, a B-17, crippled and limping across the northern German sky. Smoke trailed from engines that struggled against impossible odds. The bomber was slow, wounded, and almost entirely defenseless. Stigler closed in, finger resting on the trigger, each heartbeat a countdown. One burst would be enough. One pull would add another name to his list of kills, another burning wreck falling from the heavens. But as he drew nearer, the sight inside the cockpit froze him. The crew was not attacking. They were fighting to survive, each man battling against blood loss, freezing air, and failing engines. The words of his former commander, Gustav Rothe, echoed in his mind. In Africa, Rothe had told him, "First, last, always, never fire on a man in a parachute." Stigler had never forgotten it. A man without a chance to fight was not an enemy. He was a human being, and these men, fragile and battered, were fighting only to stay alive. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The thought of pulling the trigger felt wrong, almost blasphemous. His Messerschmitt could easily destroy the bomber. The temptation was real, and the rules of war demanded it. But Stigler made a choice that defied logic, ideology, and orders. He would not fire. Instead, he maneuvered his fighter to fly alongside the crippled bomber. Every movement was careful, precise. He guided Ye Old Pub away from German defenses, keeping it clear of flak, away from other fighters, giving the Americans a chance they did not know they had. The bomber's crew, unaware of his intentions, remained tense, expecting the attack to come at any moment. They did not understand that the man they feared was now their guardian. Stigler waved, signaling them to follow him north, toward open skies and safety. It was a dangerous gamble. Any German pilot or anti-aircraft battery could have misread the situation, ending all their lives in an instant. The B-17 limped on, engines straining under the weight of destruction and exhaustion. Every second was a risk. Every mile could be the last. For miles, the damaged bomber and the Messerschmitt flew in a silent formation, a dance of trust and courage that defied everything they had been taught. The Americans followed, unsure, afraid, yet slowly realizing that their enemy had become their protector. Stigler held the fragile formation together, keeping it clear of danger until they reached a point where they could navigate toward friendly territory. It was a small, extraordinary act, almost impossible to believe. A German fighter pilot, trained to destroy, choosing mercy in the midst of war. He saved 9 lives that day, lives that might have been lost, simply because one man remembered that there was honor beyond victory and humanity beyond obedience. And for Stigler, the choice was far from easy. He risked court-martial, execution even, for allowing his enemy to live. Yet for a few precious miles in the sky over northern Germany, a decision rooted in conscience changed the course of history for those aboard Ye Old Pub. The damaged B-17 struggled on, limping through the cold, thin air above northern Germany. Charlie Brown's hands were numb, his bloodied arm pressed uselessly against his side. Every vibration, every shudder of the failing engines reminded him that one wrong move could send the aircraft into a fatal spiral. Around him, the crew tried to maintain control, their breath visible in frozen clouds inside the cockpit, eyes wide with fear. For the first time, The reality of death pressed on them not as a distant concept, but as an immediate, tangible threat. Below, the countryside stretched out in a patchwork of snow-covered fields and forested hills, silent witnesses to the chaos in the sky. Charlie adjusted the throttle of the only engine still providing reliable power, feeling the strain on the wing spars as the bomber shuddered under stress. Every second was a battle against gravity, cold, and sheer exhaustion. Meanwhile, Franz Stigler, flying his Messerschmitt Bf-109, maintained a careful escort. He stayed close but never fired, watching the young Americans struggle to keep their bomber aloft. He saw the blood, the damage, the near panic in their faces. Something inside him resisted the training, the orders, the ideology that demanded every enemy be destroyed. The war had taught him how to kill, but not how to recognize courage, desperation, or humanity in those moments. For Charlie and his crew, the presence of the German fighter was surreal. Every second, they expected the attack that might end them instantly, but it never came. Brown's vision narrowed through the blood, frost, and smoke, and he saw the pilot in the Messerschmitt, wings almost touching, keeping pace without aggression. It was a silent decision being communicated across the cold sky. Survive, if you can. The bomber limped over frozen rivers and towns, engines sputtering, control surfaces stiff and slow. Each crew member fought against fear and fatigue, against freezing air rushing through broken panels. Gunner positions were empty, damaged weapons frozen, their protective fire ineffective. Yet somehow, through sheer determination and the unexpected mercy of the Luftwaffe pilot, they were still alive. Stigler knew that one misstep, one sudden movement from the bomber, could trigger anti-aircraft defenses on the ground. German gunners, seeing the unusual formation, might fire without hesitation. He maneuvered to shield the bomber, using his own plane as a buffer, his concentration absolute, aware that one mistake would kill not only the Americans, but possibly himself. Every inch, every maneuver was precise and calculated. Hours felt like minutes. The bomber crossed over multiple enemy positions, over industrial complexes, airfields, and towns bristling with flak and soldiers. Yet the young Americans were allowed to pass unscathed. Charlie Brown slowly began to comprehend what was happening. The enemy they had been trained to fear was actively protecting them. A fragile, temporary truce in the midst of unrelenting destruction. By the time the English coast came into view, hope began to replace terror. The waters of the North Sea glinted cold and forbidding beneath them, stretching for miles between Germany and safety. Every engine throbbed with the effort of keeping them airborne, every wing flexed under stress that might have torn it apart under normal circumstances. Still, they pressed on, guided silently by the German pilot who had chosen compassion over duty, humanity over ideology. As the bomber descended toward England, the crew began to assess the damage. Blood, frost, and exhaustion coated every surface. They were battered, broken, but alive. Charlie Brown allowed himself a brief glance at the Messerschmitt disappearing into the sky, realizing that the pilot who should have been their executioner had become their protector. In that frozen winter air, amidst death and destruction, a single act of mercy had preserved 8 lives. That day, no medals were awarded. No official reports noted the encounter. For 46 years, the story remained hidden, known only to the men who lived it. And yet, in that instant of choice, above northern Germany, the rules of war, the boundaries of ideology, and the expectations of duty had been silently rewritten. A young American pilot and a seasoned German Luftwaffe ace had shared a moment that would echo through time, not as enemies, but as witnesses to what courage, humanity, and mercy could achieve, even in the darkest of wars. Charlie Brown's bomber, year-old pub, continued limping across the northern sky, engines groaning, crew battered, their breaths visible in the freezing cabin air. Every second felt like an eternity. The German coastline stretched below them, an icy and hostile line, while miles of open sky ahead promised both danger and salvation. Brown's fingers were raw and numb, but he kept them on the controls, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of enemy fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Every moment, the thought of his crew weighed heavily on him. 8 men relied entirely on him. One wrong move could mean death. Franz Stigler, flying just behind, felt the same tension. His Messerschmitt was agile, ready, but his hand hovered above the trigger for longer than he ever remembered. He could destroy the bomber in seconds. One burst of the 20mm cannon would tear through the fuselage, and another victory would be added to his record. He had been trained to destroy these American machines, to leave no mercy. Yet, as he watched the faces inside the shattered cockpit, something changed. The fear, the exhaustion, the fragile humanity of the crew confronted him with a truth no training could erase. These were not faceless enemies. They were men, struggling to survive. Brown's bomber passed directly over the German airfield, where Stigler had taken off. Anti-aircraft crews on the ground followed the damaged aircraft with their guns, unaware of the dangerous gamble Stigler was taking above. Stigler's decision was a silent rebellion against the code of war. Flying so close, matching speed and altitude, he created a shield. Ground crews saw the formation of 2 planes and assumed it was a German escort. They did not fire. Stigler's Messerschmitt acted as an invisible barrier between life and death. Inside year-older pub, Brown noticed the German fighter alongside. Confusion flashed across his face. Could this man be trying to kill them, or something else? He radioed his top gunner, Bertrand Coulomb, ordering him to hold fire. The men froze, unsure, eyes wide, as the bomber stayed on its perilous path north. The ocean lay ahead, a freezing expanse that promised death if they fell into it. Engines sputtered, systems failed, but Stigler remained steady, unwavering. Every mile passed felt like hours. Every breath in the frozen cockpit carried the weight of life itself. When the bomber finally crossed the safety of the North Sea, the danger shifted, but did not vanish. One misstep, one engine failure, and the crew could plummet into the icy waters. Stigler could not follow. Fuel was low, radiator damaged, and returning to Germany was mandatory. Yet he stayed just long enough to guide the bomber beyond immediate danger before pulling away silently into the black winter sky. The 2 men shared no words, only a silent acknowledgement across the frigid void. The enemy had become a protector, and a protector had become a witness to humanity in the midst of destruction. Years later, Charlie Brown would speak of that day for the first time in public, more than 4 decades after the mission. He described the battered bomber, the frozen crew, and the German pilot who made the impossible choice. Franz Stigler had risked his life and his freedom, breaking every regulation, defying every order, to save strangers. Their encounter, brief in time but monumental in consequence, would ripple across decades, shaping lives in ways neither man could have imagined. When they finally met in person decades later, in a Florida hotel lobby, the 2 men embraced. 66 years of secrecy, fear, and wartime hatred melted away in that single moment. They were no longer enemies. They were linked forever by courage, compassion, and an unspoken code that transcended ideology. The men they had been in 1943, pilots, warriors, adversaries, were replaced by 2 elderly men who understood that mercy was a power stronger than any weapon. and honor could exist even in war. This story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler is not just about planes or battles. It is about the choices that define humanity, the moments when courage becomes compassion, and the extraordinary lengths one individual can go to preserve life against all odds. In the end, the skies over northern Germany that day witnessed more than destruction. They witnessed mercy, and it changed the lives of everyone involved.